Branch 3 is again in session. Your silence is requested. Please be seated.
Can you hand them a copy of that instruction that I printed? One's for me and mine. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So what I handed you was, just a first run at an instruction. We're not even on the record right now. But I had thought about what we would actually say if we were going to instruct the jury on that issue, and I didn't like standard 275 because I didn't think it fit. And I wanted it to be very clear. So if at some point you want an instruction like that, we can still work to modify it. But I thought, given the ruling yesterday, we should have something, but not a standard 275.
Yeah, this is a lot better.
And I think you can consider it now or to be read still when the jury comes back in, or we can take it up later and give it as an instruction just during the closing instructions.
We'd like to just discuss with Mr. Cayer
Sure.
very quickly.
Right? Okay. We don't have to print them. And tell Lisa, can you tell Lisa?
Dan, I emailed them to her,
Okay.
but she hasn't gotten copies
Tell her don't work on them yet because I spent 4 hours on them last night and she's just going to do the same effort that I've done.
Thank you, Judge.
All right, let's go on the record. We're back on the record. The appearances remain the same. The jury has not returned to the courtroom yet.
Yes, we discussed the modified 275 that Your Honor had prepared. We think it's very appropriately drafted and discussed with Mr. Cayer. It would be our preference that you read it to the jury prior to resuming the testimony.
All right, and then change the first line maybe to is being presented, evidence is being presented.
Yes,
Okay.
sure.
Any comments from the state one way or the other on that proposed instruction? He's asking that when the jury comes out, I read it now, just saying evidence is being presented regarding. Okay. All right. Anything else?
No.
All right. Please stand for the jury. Please be seated. Detective Holschbach, if you want to return to the witness stand and replace your mask with the shield, and then I remind you, you remain under oath.
Thank you, Your Honor.
And while the detective is doing that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to instruct you that evidence is being presented regarding the defendant's concern about allegations of other criminal conduct of the defendant for which the defendant is not on trial. There is no information being presented that these other allegations were actually made or that the criminal conduct even occurred. The evidence is being presented for you to consider it only on the issue of motive. You may not consider this testimony about any allegations of other criminal conduct as evidence to conclude that the defendant has a certain character or a certain character trait, and that the defendant acted in conformity with that trait or character with respect to the offense charged in this case. The evidence is being received on the issue of motive, that is, whether the defendant has a reason to desire the result of the offense charged. You may consider this evidence only for the purpose I have described, giving it the weight you determine it deserves. It is not to be used to conclude that the defendant is a bad person, and for that reason guilty of the offenses charged. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Ready to continue, Your Honor. I think where we left off, you kind of were giving a summary, talked about some things you were beginning to become aware of from the scene. My next question was going to be, when Mr. Cayer told you about what he did to Sabrina, did you ask him at various times to see if he could recall more about the other two people that he mentioned as well?
Yes.
Okay. At that point then, I would like to play a audio clip. Play 1J audio clip number 6.
What did you do to the other two people? You think there's a knife on a blunt bun?
I think so.
When you say blunt, what does that mean? You remember what it was?
I don't know what happened. I avoided the jaw.
Like if you were slashing with a blade?
Or using a hammer.
A hammer?
When I was like they're slashing a blade using a hammer, because when I went to the bathroom.
The bathroom, you think there was a hammer? Something that wasn't a knife, though, like a blunt object, you're saying? Okay.
Okay. The audio clip number 6, do you think that accurately depicts a segment of what Mr. Cayer told you?
Yes, it does.
Is that kind of consistent with what he was saying in various parts of the interview, that he used also, besides a knife, at some point, some kind of object like a hammer, but not a hammer?
Yeah, I think it's a great example of, I could just say, oh, he said hammer, but he clarified, well, like a hammer, not a hammer,
Okay.
that there's a separate weapon besides the knife. There's a knife, there's a blunt object, and then we're getting into greater detail about each individual victim and location, so we're getting more and more specific as we go on.
When you're talking to Mr. Cayer, I think at various points you've already testified that Mr. Cayer indicated he rode a bicycle to Sabrina Teague's house. Is that correct?
Correct.
And I think he also described the bike. Is that correct?
Yes, he did.
Yeah, I'd like to play 1J audio clip number 7 at this point.
What kind of bike do you have?
It's actually like Dennis' old bike. It's red and gray on the ground.
Red and gray?
Yeah.
Like a mountain bike? Or
It's,
10 speed?
it's a 10 speed, but it's more
Short one?
it's red and gray. It's more like a street bike with a little mountain bike. Kind of.
What kind of bike do you have?
Audio clip 1J audio clip number 7. Does that accurately describe what Mr. Cayer told you about the bicycle?
Yes, it does.
And throughout the interview, you can periodically ask Mr. Cayer if he has any more information to add. You recall doing things like that?
Multiple times I would say, can you remember anything new? Can you remember more about this? Close your eyes, think about it, you're doing good. You know, those are phrases I'm using throughout the entire interview.
Okay. At this point, I'm going to play 1J audio clip number 8.
I've had to attempt her more than once because I remember the ones that just falling in the grass. But it was the cement. And the only cement, like I said, is the garage in the basement.
In the basement, okay.
So, but the garage is just very fast from the plant. They're similar to the ones in the window, so it's Greek. And I'm going to tangle it.
That particular clip, number 8, do you think it accurately depicts some of the additional information that Mr. Cayer provided to you?
It does, yes.
And I think earlier in your testimony you referenced that at one point Mr. Cayer asked if Sabrina was going to be okay. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay. At this point I'd like to play another audio clip. It is 1J audio clip number 9.
She's at the hospital somewhere. Do you think she'd be okay? I mean, did you say her like she'd survive, or do you think she would not be okay? I mean, if you had to guess, you know a lot about knives, and you're a pretty smart dude. So do you think she's alive or dead?
Honest answer was fucking negative. The thing with me probably fighting insurance really hardcore. I just hope.
Hard to say.
Doctors said it was swift, I guess. I hope.
She would need doctors right away, right?
Probably.
Because why would she need the doctors right away?
Well, the area that I do understand, like I said,
That's a bad area, huh?
it's either close to the neck or the torso there. And hopefully it just went by the collarbone. I don't know.
So I don't
think it's good, though. It's not good.
It's not good?
I don't think it's good at all. So it's just that's the one stupid one fucking I do remember. It's like a very chancy that it's not good. So if I just have a water, which I kind of did.
That particular audio clip was number 9. Do you believe it accurately depicts part of your conversation with Mr. Cayer between June 7th and June 8th, 2016?
Yes, I do.
What did Mr. Cayer what does he say about the doctors?
Said that they better be swift.
And who specifically were you talking to Mr. Cayer about? Which person or victim?
Sabrina Teague specifically. The context of this conversation is specifically about if she is alive or not. Mr. Cayer had asked more than once if she was alive or not. I would not tell him. At this point, I know that she's not alive, but I won't tell him that. I just say, do you think she's alive? Why would she need doctors? What area? And again, we're expanding more and more. You know, initially he's giving me pieces. We revisit that topic, more pieces, and then, you know, like I said in the summary in the end, you get the whole picture.
Now, again, throughout in different parts of the interview with Mr. Cayer, I think you referenced that he talks about a bathroom that's bloody. Is that correct? At the scene on Riverdale, is that right?
Yes.
I'm going to play another audio clip. It's 1J audio clip number 10.
Attached to another thing in the bathroom. I remember, like I said, I was house swinging. I remember the floor on the camera. I don't remember everything. Was so.
Is there anything else you remember?
I really want to say there's water, but then I just hit the fucking floor.
You recall Mr. Cayer making those comments?
I do. That's accurate.
And what did he say he was doing in the bathroom in that clip?
In this particular clip, it's very short, but he describes that there's, blood or redness all over, and he kind of just talks about a closet, and he talks about water in this particular clip.
Does he use the word swinging right there? Did you hear that?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Now, I guess you described how you believed you treated Mr. Cayer with a lot of respect and cordially. Is that correct during this interview?
Yes, of course.
And besides allowing him to the bathroom, because it's a long interview, was he allowed to, for example, to have something to drink periodically throughout the interview?
Yes, and he was even able to select the choice. It wasn't just water. It was what was available to me. I remember he wanted tea. I didn't have tea, but I said I have orange juice, I have water. He chose orange juice, and then he got additional orange juice more than once. So I was making sure that he could use the bathroom or have access to beverages.
Okay. If you recall at one point in about this area of the interview, a nurse having to check on his leg where the dog bit Mr. Cayer. Do you recall that?
I do, yes. I actually summoned the nurse to say, hey, can we check on his wound again? Because he had stated it was bleeding. And at one point, I'm not sure if it's exactly right at this moment, he made comments of just let me bleed out or things like that. And I said, well, we'll check on that. So I said, let's get some staff in here to make sure that we can stop that.
Okay. Did you ever ask Mr. Cayer during the interview if he was drinking or using drugs that evening?
Yes, I did. And he specifically said that he was not, and that I could even check his blood, and the blood would show that.
Now, we talked a little bit about Mr. Cayer at one point mentioning a blanket. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Do you recall what color he said the blanket was?
A red blanket.
I'm going to play another audio clip from the interview with Mr. Cayer. It's 1J audio clip 11.
There's some smell that but there's also a smell that I can distinctly remember, but not like
What kind of smell?
I don't know. I just remember that. It got me feeling.
That audio clip number 11, do you think that accurately depicts some of the information Mr. Cayer told you?
Yes, it does.
Sometimes it's difficult to hear. What was he saying about the smell?
The smell specifically, he described it as not being appealing or being a bad smell.
Something smelled bad.
Correct.
He's talking about the scene that night?
Yes, he talked about throwing the red blanket. I don't know if we talk about it more than once, but he threw the red blanket, specifically in the hallway and specifically to cover up blood. And then at this given moment, he's talking about also a smell that's unpleasant.
During your interview over those hours, does Mr. Cayer ever mention a shovel?
He does, more than once. He talks about having a shovel swinging towards his face. He thinks that occurred in the garage, and he remembers actually getting struck in the face with the shovel. And he thought that it was when someone was fighting him off when he was attacking Sabrina and the gas station shirt person.
This time I'm going to play another audio clip. It's going to be 1J audio clip number 12.
The shovel.
I think I got hit with a shovel.
You got hit in the head with a shovel?
I think so. Not sure. I don't know, it was a smile thing. It was like, that's the thing.
What's that?
I don't know, a shovel.
Do you remember the shovel now?
A shovel what's in the face, I think.
That audio clip number 12, do you think it accurately depicts some of the information that Mr. Cayer provided to you on June 7th and June 8th, 2016?
I do.
You described during the hours that you're with Mr. Cayer, you'd find out some more information, and then you kind of go back and revisit things. So you kind of go back and forth throughout the interview. Is that correct?
Correct.
You recall talking to Mr. Cayer when he specifically uses the phrase, let me see here. Let's strike that. One of the things you mentioned earlier was water in the bathroom that Mr. Cayer told you about. Is that correct?
Correct.
Does Mr. Cayer ever tell you anything about washing his feet?
Yes, specifically, and that would be different than the bathroom where the one victim is attacked. This would be a separate water, and he talked about it being white and a sink and washing his feet. That's at least how I understood it when he was explaining it to me, like not the attack wetness, but a separate wetness where he would be washing his feet. And he ultimately said he was washing blood off his feet at one point in the interview.
Okay. I'd like to play another audio clip for you. It's 1J audio clip number 13.
Feet were in the sink? Why were your feet in the sink? What's that? You can't hear it. Because they were a mess? Because what? Blood were on your feet, so what sink were they in them?
That clip number 13 that we just listened to, do you believe that accurately reflects some of the information Mr. Cayer provided to you?
I do.
Now, at some point, I'm going to use it as a reference point, so to kind of 4:30 a.m., 4:32 specifically a.m. Do you recall Sergeant Yankee and a nurse when they were going to begin a collection process of collecting evidence off of Mr. Cayer's body.
Yes, I do remember that.
Okay. And are you present for most of the collection process?
I believe for all of it, yes.
Okay. You've referenced earlier that Mr. Cayer, again, throughout the interview, would mention shower. Do you recall that?
I do.
Play another audio clip for you. It's number 14. It is 1J 14. 1J audio clip 14.
Remember anything new? You're really doing a good job on that. I was thinking about the rain, but I heard that was a shower. A shower? That was a shower. It was a shower? Who took a shower? You turned showers on? Both showers on?
That particular audio clip, number 14, do you believe it accurately depicts some of the information Mr. Cayer provided to you in that evening?
I do.
You also talked about during your interview, and in court today, about the interview with Mr. Cayer, that Mr. Cayer described a different kind of motion in the bathroom where there was an attack, and he said a hacking motion. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes, I do.
Play another audio clip here. It's going to be audio 1J audio clip number 15.
Is there anything you think we haven't talked about? Anything that's remember that we haven't talked about? I know we talked about a lot.
The fact that there's a hacking motion in the bathroom. So that's the only other movement in the hand or whatever, but I don't think there'd be a knife, so we don't try to get a little bit. That doesn't make sense to do like that.
Yeah, you told me about that in the bathroom. Yep. And you said that's not Sabrina, that's someone else.
That particular clip, number 15, do you believe that accurately depicts some of the information Mr. Cayer provided to you that evening?
I do.
When you're talking to Mr. Cayer throughout the evening and early morning, does he ever tell you what kind of shoes that he would have had on when he went over to 1368 Riverdale, to Sabrina Teague's house?
He described his shoes as being white and a DC brand shoe.
Have you ever heard of that particular brand, DC?
I'm familiar with it. I've seen DC shoes, yes.
Do you know on the particular shoe, that brand, do they have DC written on them somewhere, a logo?
There's many different designs that DC puts out. I don't know how accurate this is. I'm certainly not a shoe expert, but I would call it like a skateboard type shoe. Often DC is on them. I don't know if they're always on them, but in my mind I'm picturing that the DC logo, and there'd be like a skateboarding type shoe.
Do you recall during the interview, Mr. Cayer describing a term, getting back at the world?
I do remember that, yes.
Do you recall anything more about what he said in that particular segment?
Yeah, I mean, in totality, this is very lengthy, but in totality, it would be, when he left Cormier, he was very angry, and he was just like ready to get back at the entire world. And me as the listener, after interviewing him for almost 10 hours, Nicole was not available to him based on being out of state. I think that would have been someone that he really...
I'm going to make an objection here to him offering his opinion about what Mr. Cayer was feeling and experiencing. He can testify to what was said, but this is going too far afield, Your Honor.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right.
We can stop that.
Do you want to rephrase the question?
Sure. Well, I think I won't ask any more related to that. He's already answered the question on getting back at the world, so I'm going to go on to a different question.
Go ahead.
You recall, again, Mr. Cayer, well, let me ask this. At some point towards more the end of the interview process, you said that Sergeant Yankee and a nurse, what did you say her name was?
I didn't say yet, but I do know her as Dana Stieber.
Okay. So Sergeant Yankee and Dana Stieber were collecting evidence off of Mr. Cayer's body, is that correct?
Correct. The three of us were. So Dana would have been. I've worked with her on many other cases, more specifically sexual assault cases, but she has training to forensically collect the evidence. So it's like a swabbing. So different parts of his body. She would be collecting it, changing gloves, and then Sergeant Yankee would take possession of it, and then Sergeant Yankee would be the evidence custodian. So Dana would pass it to Sergeant Yankee. I'm standing here and I'm recording each piece as we go, and then Sergeant Yankee would be in charge of the evidence to maintain the custody, take it back to the sheriff's office, check it into evidence.
Okay. During that process, towards the end of the entire interview, towards the end, do you recall Sergeant Yankee taking a little bit more active role and asking some questions towards the end of the interview?
Yes.
And do you recall, maybe you already testified to this, did you indicate that Mr. Cayer in some place during this entire interview mentioned a shirt that was either a Burger King or a Subway shirt?
Yes, I did testify to that, and I do recall that, and specifically Mr. Cayer saying Subway or Burger King, and it being a work shirt, and then describing the colors and the shape on the emblem.
Okay. At this point, I'd like to play another audio clip. It's 1J audio clip number 16.
How did your hand get cut?
I'm thinking this one,
Sorry, Pakistan, you know, right here in South.
The garage, I know the foliage is only 2 spots. They have that one in front of the main window. That's one in front of the fence. The garage to the area is about like 7-8 feet, so she got it out of her hands or something, I don't know.
Sabrina got the knife out of your hands?
I don't know, there's a shovel too that I think hit me or I fell on it. Or it's the shirt person was by her.
The shirt person? Was the shirt person a male or a female?
I think it's a male one because it is a black hat and there's something longer hair, but it's a girl and I don't know.
Longer hair?
If it was a girl, it would be longer hair, so I think it's a guy. I just remember the gas station shirt, the hat, and
Can you tell me what does gas station shirt mean? I've not heard that expression before.
like Burger King or Subway with that uncomfortable cotton that no one ever wants to wear. Color similar colors, some of those matches the outside.
So, is there something, did you say there's some sort of insignia on
It was, I want to say it was red and white, I think.
So a red and white.
Oh yeah, well, I think it's actually, I think it was red.
Is it a t-shirt?
It was like a work shirt, I guess, like Christian's on work.
Oh, okay.
That particular clip, number 16, do you believe it accurately represents a portion of the interview with Jacob Cayer that evening and early morning?
I do.
As we continue into the interview process, as we're going through it today in court, that you went through with Mr. Cayer, do you recall Sergeant Yankee talking to Mr. Cayer some more about what happened to the knife that he would use. Do you recall that?
I do, yes.
I'm going to play another video clip. It's going to be 1J audio clip number 17.
Where did the knife go?
It's gotta be between the garage and the foliage.
Between the garage and the foliage, do you think?
Yeah. There's a three-style garage. Her car. It's the one that's, she's always quite little. She's always the closest spot to the window of that garage.
The closest spot to the window of the garage?
There's a big window. There's a big window in front of the house.
Okay.
You see the road is the closest stall next to that window.
Okay, so let me see if I understand this. So there's a big window in the house?
Mm-hmm. The wall. Sorry, just can't miss it from the road.
Okay.
The closest stall.
And the closest stall to that big window?
I would have you guys check from there towards the fence, because that's the foliage.
So check in the foliage
So
next to the garage, across from the garage?
You're in the house. If you're in this house, then you look at the garage. The fence across.
Okay, so the fence across, and you think it's by the fence?
I remember falling over there.
You remember falling over by the fence?
Falling.
Her falling?
Yeah, that's.
Are you talking about Sabrina?
Yeah, I think it started in the garage.
Okay.
I remember cement. There's only two places with cement. That in the basement. So I remember falling in the foliage. So that's gotta be where the shovel would be in the garage.
The shovel would be in the garage?
Yeah, that's where it would be. So I remember after she fell and tried to get in the car.
That particular audio clip, number 17, do you believe it accurately depicts a portion of the interview with Jacob Cayer from June 7th into June 8th, sometime during that time of 2016?
I do.
During your interview with Mr. Cayer, does he ever mention a railing inside the garage?
He does specifically, yes.
Now, again, towards the end, at least of the interview, you've already just heard that last clip where Mr. Cayer is trying to describe to you and Sergeant Yankee where he thinks the knife would be that he used. Did you hear that? You heard that in the clip?
Yes, I did, and you know, it's again noteworthy when she would say, "You fell," he said, "No, she fell," and she's Sabrina. So twice, just in that short clip, 17, he corrects Sergeant Yankee twice just in that clip alone. So I think it's a good demonstration again where she's trying to listen, he's talking softly, she says it to repeat it, and then he clarifies yes or no. So it's not like he's just agreeing to what she's saying.
Now, towards the end of the interview, when Sergeant Yankee's talking to him more than she did throughout the first part, to try and clarify with Mr. Cayer, the scene itself, some of the things he described, a fence where the knife would have potentially be located that he used, things like that. Did you and Sergeant Yankee have him draw a map for you?
Yeah, I took a clipboard and a pen and took his hand out of the handcuff, and literally we drew a map. He drew the map describing in detail where things were on the map.
You know, at this time, I have exhibit number 5. It's the map. Defense counsel has a copy. With the court's permission, I'd like to use over a projector and see if Sergeant Holtzclaw can identify exhibit 5 and describe it.
Any objection? No. All right. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
Sergeant Holzbach, we've marked prior to you getting on the stand, an exhibit, a paper exhibit, labeled it Exhibit Number 5. Do you see that particular exhibit up on the overhead screen at this time?
I do.
Tell the jury, what is Exhibit 5?
So Exhibit 5 is that map that I'm discussing in my previous testimony. Mr. Cayer has this piece of paper, a pen. The paper is on a clipboard I provided him, and he's drawing out, and we're using this as a visual for him to explain to us what this scene looks like, where Sabrina fell, where the knife is, and we're using this as a visual aid for him to more specifically describe the scene.
There's a
Your Honor.
pointer by the witness.
That's what I was going to ask, if we still have it up there. I'm going to ask you some questions, Sergeant Holschbach, about Exhibit 5. And the laser pointer you have, there's a button, I think, as we described, there's a button above the arrows.
Got it?
Okay. So, as far as drawing out first the house, could you point on the diagram the part that Mr. Cayer actually drew out the house where he was describing that Sabrina lived and where this happened?
So this would be the actual house, the 1368 Sabrina and Sonny's house. He went into the detail about the individual 3 garage doors, the big window,
Okay.
front door.
I'm going to stop you. I'm going to go
Sorry.
piece by piece. So that particular rectangle that you just put your pointer at up on the screen that has, I guess, it says garage 1, 2, 3, it says house, gigantic window. On Exhibit 5, you're pointing to the rectangle at the top center of Exhibit 5, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Who actually drew that rectangle and all the little stalls of the garage and the window and things like that?
Jacob, Mr. Cayer, drew this.
Okay. And then would he tell you or Sergeant Yankee what were the particular things, for example, like the garage stalls and the window and things like that?
Yes.
Okay. And then those would be labeled.
Correct. So some of the labeling or the writing would be Sergeant Yankee or my handwriting. But the actual drawing and then the verbal description as he's explaining it, he's drawing it, and then at times we would add the label and confirm with him that what he was saying is correct.
So if you or Sergeant Yankee are writing on their house or garage, like 1, 2, 3, are you still getting all that information from Mr. Cayer?
Yes, this entire map is him. It's him describing it. The drawing itself is him. The only thing that we would have added to it would have been the label at times. I think some of it he labeled himself, but his writing wasn't very legible. And then the signature is his signature as well.
Okay. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you, when Mr. Cayer is drawing this, during your interview with him, had you been out to 1368 Riverdale before this drawing's done by Mr. Cayer?
Never. I have no idea what this house looks like. I've never been there previously on any calls. I have no idea what this looks like.
Okay. So then, if we kind of start from the house that's drawn by Mr. Cayer, I want to kind of work our way down towards the bottom of the exhibit. We're going to kind of work our way down on this exhibit. There's a long, it says driveway, is that correct? Do you see that?
Yes, I see this.
And who drew this labeled driveway? Who drew that?
Mr. Cayer drew the driveway as he was describing it being a long driveway and then going up to the house.
Okay. And it looks like there's 2 spots on this diagram where it says the word fence. Is that correct?
Correct. Right here and right here.
Okay. The record could reflect you're kind of pointing at the 2 words that say fence. The fence looks like it's in like an L type shape. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Who actually drew this fence on this diagram?
I know he described it and drew it and labeled part of it, I believe. I don't recall as we sit here today if I maybe made it darker just so we could see it better. I think the pen was losing ink. I recall kind of like scribbling at one point maybe to make sure the ink was working. So I just don't want to say 100% who drew like little parts of it. But just to be clear, he drew it, or it was coming from him explaining it. Sometimes we would assist with labeling, or maybe I would, fill it in so you could visually see it. I hope that helps give a little, description there.
When this is happening, when Mr. Cayer is drawing this, did you know that there was a fence at the crime scene?
No, I didn't know anything about this scene.
Okay. And then there's a part of the diagram where it says where Sabrina fell, and there's a line. It goes from those words over towards an area near the fence. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what is that supposed to depict?
So he was describing throughout the interview, and then this, basically it's starting in the garage, the attack between Mr. Cayer and Sabrina, and then going out towards the plants and foliage by this fence across from the garage. And then that she fell somewhere here. Sabrina fell somewhere here.
And so you're putting the laser pointer where Mr. Cayer said Sabrina fell. After there's words on Exhibit 5 where Sabrina fell, there's a line and it goes over towards a little circle kind of by the word fence. Is that correct? In the corner?
Correct, where the fence comes together between north-south and west-east, and then like a 90-degree angle there.
Okay. And then there's also a part of the diagram that says the word knife on the diagram. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And then there's a line and an arrow coming away from the word knife. And can you describe, so we have it on the record, what's that? What did Mr. Cayer indicate when that is put on the diagram?
He was explaining where he thought the knife was now, in the moment we were talking about it.
And where is that depicted on this diagram that Mr. Cayer drew?
Between the driveway and the corner of that fence, kind of in the plant or grass area.
Okay. All right. And then, again, is that where Mr. Cayer told you and Sergeant Yankee that a knife was found?
Yes, and I would later find out, I believe on the 9th, perhaps. I'm not 100% sure, but certainly long after my contact with Mr. Cayer, that at the time they hadn't found the knife yet, is my understanding, and that this was like literally right where it was.
Okay. But I guess my important question I have for you is when Mr. Cayer is telling you this, you didn't know at that time where a knife was going to eventually, you didn't know where a knife was at that time?
No, not at all. I did not.
Because you're indicating you think maybe they didn't even find it yet.
I would find that out later. So as we're drawing this map, as Mr. Cayer is describing it,
Right.
I think Sergeant Yankee first asked him, where's the knife now? And they were kind of clarifying that. And then that kind of led us into this map, like just show us like right where kind of things happen, lay it out for us. So we're capturing as much evidence directly from Mr. Cayer as we can capture, to understand what happened and what he's recalling.
Okay. I see another box or kind of square rectangle, and it's labeled Other House. Is that correct?
Correct.
You recall who drew this? It says Other House on the map, Exhibit 5.
As we sit here today, I do not recall. I don't know if Mr. Cayer, I think maybe did the box. I'm not 100%, so I don't want to. It was certainly in the same format of him saying, there's a fence, there's another house, it's not their house, it's a separate property. So I don't know if Sergeant Yankee kind of maybe put some things on it as he's describing it, but it would be coming from his recollection.
Okay. Any words that are written on here, whether it's you or Sergeant Yankee writing, or Mr. Cayer writing some words maybe, the words written on here are placed on there because Mr. Cayer told you where things were located?
That would be accurate, yes.
Sometimes it's hard to read, so on the bottom of Exhibit 5, what does it say at the bottom of Exhibit 5 on the left as you're looking at the exhibit?
This part here says map drawn by, the Y is very faint, and then it's his name written out. I would have wrote this out. Both of this is my writing. I would have wrote out Jacob P. Cayer, 525 of 90. Then I wrote my name, Sergeant Zach Holschbach, I signed it. That's my badge number, 286. And then this signature right here is Jacob actually, where he actually signed it. And it's signifying that he drew this map. There's a date, 6/8/16, and the time at the time when he signed it, when we were including the map, was 8:29 a.m.
So now he signs it on Wednesday, June 8th, 2016, 8:29 a.m. By he, I mean Jacob Cayer.
Correct.
Okay. Offer exhibit number 5 at this time.
Any objection?
No.
Exhibit 5 will be received.
Again, towards the end of the interview with Mr. Cayer, and I know it was a lengthy one as we were talking about this today. Do you recall at one point, besides drawing the map, Mr. Cayer attempting to basically reenact what he did to Sabrina Teague the night this happened?
Yes, it was during kind of the map portion, because I distinctly remember him having the pen for drawing the map, and I had him demonstrate on Sergeant Yankee where he thought he stabbed Sabrina. So he's using the pen as a knife, and then Sergeant Yankee would be Sabrina, playing the role of Sabrina, and he reenacted with the knife where he actually stabbed her.
Okay. I'm going to play for you at this time. It's called 1J Video number 1.
Do you feel it go in? It's in her chest, upper. Okay, so like neck area, upper shoulder.
All I see when my memory is this much.
Okay, so you're pushing forward with the knife. Okay. So it's somewhere in that upper left chest area or upper shoulder area or close to the neck. Okay. Okay, and so that's the first time. When's the second time? I mean, is it like, oh my God, I lost control, and then?
That's smaller, it's just the form of the mechanic, that's all. And then she's falling the rest of the footage.
And then she's falling. How'd she get from here to here?
Okay, the audio video segment we just played, which we called 1J Video 1, does that accurately depict a portion of the video that you just described a moment ago, where Mr. Cayer is reenacting the stabbing to Sabrina Teague?
Yes, it does, and I'm the one that captured that.
Okay. Again, towards the end of the interview, do you ever recall Mr. Cayer using the words, "Where am I going to be landing in"?
Yes, I think twice in the interview total he described where he was going after this, whether it would be something psychiatric or jail. And he had preferred, he verbalized that he'd rather go somewhere psychiatric.
Again, towards the end of this interview, we just looked at a map, Exhibit 5, that was dated June 8, 2016, 8:29 a.m. So that we're getting towards the end of this interview that you said right at the beginning of your testimony went to about 9:02 a.m., is that right?
Correct. That would have been the time where Mr. Cayer was turned over to 2 deputies to be transported.
Okay. Right towards the end of the interview, I know you said that you kind of resisted telling him if somebody was really dead or things like that. Did you ever tell Mr. Cayer towards the end of the interview that someone is dead?
I never said the word dead, I don't think. I told him that he was being booked for first-degree intentional homicide, but I never would tell him who was actually dead at that time.
Okay. When you told him about that's what was happening, what was his response or reaction?
No surprise or reaction or response in that, like demanding to know who, or big sadness, like, oh my God, I was hoping no one was dead. Like it was just nothing.
You indicated that you were with Sergeant Yankee and Nurse Dana Stieber. Kind of like you described it, you said, I think your words were, you working as a team to collect evidence from Mr. Cayer at St. Vincent Hospital. Is that correct?
Correct. I would describe it as Dana is doing the actual collection from Mr. Cayer's person, taking that, turning it over to Sergeant Yankee, then everyone would change gloves, and then another collection would occur. I'm basically noting that. And so that would have been about 2 hours, 4:32 to 6:32-ish approximately. About a 2-hour window right in the middle there that the evidence is being collected. We're still talking, but the focus was the evidence collection, the photography.
When you're completed with Mr. Cayer and the interview's done, I think you described that Dana Stieber, the nurse, is taking swabs off of various parts of Mr. Cayer's body. Is that correct?
Correct.
And also, did you see Dana Stieber actually taking photographs of Mr. Cayer's body?
Correct.
Did you, when you're completed with assisting in the collection of the swabs and evidence from Mr. Cayer, what do you and Sergeant Yankee do with those particular pieces of evidence? For example, the swabs or anything else that was taken from Mr. Cayer or from that room, from that hospital?
So Sergeant Yankee would be what we call an evidence custodian for that specific evidence. So we have chain of custody. So she takes it and that particular evidence remains in her custody. And then she transports it to the Brown County Sheriff's Office. I accompanied her in my own police vehicle. And then when we get to the Sheriff's Office, depending on what the evidence was, some of it needs to be maybe repackaged or put in something to dry. Because if you don't properly handle certain evidence, I won't get into that too much, but you have to preserve it. And then you also want to consider that nothing gets cross-contaminated, so you don't want to put that evidence in a chamber with other evidence from a different scene. At this point, we don't have any scene evidence. We have never been to the scene, so we couldn't have brought there was no potential for cross-contamination, but we wanted to put that evidence somewhere and say that's this evidence, so we make sure that potentially there wouldn't be cross-contamination later or anything of that nature. So we go to great lengths to make sure we preserve the evidence, package it properly, store it, and then we ultimately would later seal and log it, with individual seals and initials. But Sergeant Yankee would be lead on the evidence. I was kind of taking lead on the interview, so we were kind of working together.
You were present and accompanied Sergeant Yankee when all the evidence was taken back to the Sheriff's Department and put in a safe and secure area.
Correct.
Your Honor, I don't believe I have any further questions for Sergeant Holschbach at this time.
Okay, thank you. Cross-examination, Mr. Cotton?
How long does the court want me to go for?
Do you think you'll be more than 45 minutes?
It's tough to say.
Okay, well, let's just see where we're at.
Okay. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
So I understand that the interrogation in this case, if you will, was over the course of 8+ hours, fair to say?
Yes, sir.
We could call it an interrogation or an interview or whatever you want to call it, right?
I would say it would be more along the lines of an interview, certainly no interrogating.
And when we talk about interrogations, sometimes a person is taken to a police room at police headquarters and questioned in that environment, right?
Sure, yes.
And you might understand that in this case there was no questioning at any police department from Mr. Cayer.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. And the questioning that you're familiar with is what took place in between the two hospitals and the ambulance when you were involved.
Correct.
And that's why when we're talking 8, 9, 10 hours, it's spanning over that period of time, right?
Correct.
You you have both, I think we've established this, but you have both video and audio that took place in this case, right?
Yes.
And I'm assuming that you've had a chance to go back and prepare for your testimony and listen to those items.
I have definitely reviewed them and prepared. As we sit here today, I wouldn't be comfortable saying I've listened to every single second. Again, re-listen to it.
Right. You did prepare a very detailed report in this case. You would agree with that?
I prepared a report, yes.
And it's a detailed report. It's 27 pages long.
27 pages, yes, including the boilerplate front page.
That's a fairly long report in your experience, isn't it?
It's not. It's long, sure, yeah.
And the reason it's so long is because there's a lot of information you tried to capture in here.
Correct.
And your role in this case was different than other deputies. You didn't go to the crime scene and do any investigation at the crime scene.
I did not do any investigation at the crime scene after Mr. Cayer was completely turned over after that 9:02 a.m. I did respond to the crime scene after that, not with evidence or anything, handling any evidence or doing anything at the scene. I didn't go into the scene. I would be just outside the scene. And I wanted to tell the team that was there kind of like what he had talked about to assist them in locating items of evidentiary value and for them to process the scene, kind of just give them a summary of, hey, this is what he just said in the last 9 hours or whatever.
So you're briefing the other officers after your experience with Mr. Cayer.
That's a fair assessment, yes.
Now, before you met Mr. Cayer, you did go to the sheriff's department to be generally updated on what you were getting into. You've already testified to that, right?
Yes, not much of an update, but yes, I responded there first, yes, sir.
Right, it's your testimony. It wasn't much of an update. It was a very brief overview of things.
That would be accurate, yes.
And then you went straight to the hospital to go find Mr. Cayer.
Correct.
And in terms of your contact with him, we certainly have videos we can play, and we have audio that you've watched today. But what I'd like to do is just walk through a little bit of your report to talk about some of the interactions you had with Mr. Cayer.
Sure.
You would agree that he was in the emergency room when you arrived at the hospital. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And that's because he was receiving some sort of medical treatment, right?
Yes, he was in police custody. There was other officers already there, and he had or was finishing up medical treatment, yes.
You made a comment earlier about ketamine. Do you remember that?
I do.
And that's because Mr. Cayer mentioned ketamine to you, right?
Correct.
Specifically mentioned that he had been administered ketamine. Or injected with ketamine.
He talked about the ketamine wearing off or something of that nature. I remember as he said it, thinking, was it like something he used, or was it used at the hospital at the moment he said it? I do remember him definitely saying ketamine, and that's how I would have heard it.
Exactly. That the ketamine is wearing off, but in your mind you don't know, is this a street drug he took, or is it something the hospital gave him, right?
Yeah, I was an undercover narcotics investigator for over 5 years before getting promoted, so I know that ketamine is also a drug of abuse at times, so I didn't know for sure what he was talking about. You
became aware that was administered by the medical personnel, right?
As we sit here today, I'm aware of that, yes, but I do remember...
But then my question is what you know today.
Yes, sir. Then, yeah, I am aware as we sit here today. Yes, I would agree with that.
And there was some discussion about Mr. Cayer being under the influence. You know today that he wasn't under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Would you agree with that?
I know that he said he wasn't, and that we would take his blood.
There were 2 blood draws done, right?
Yes, I know that. I don't know what those blood results were.
Okay. You've never had a chance to look at any blood results in this case?
I'm sorry, please say
again. You've never had a chance to look at any blood results, right?
I have not reviewed any.
Okay. So ketamine, we know today, was administered by the hospital. What was in his blood, you can't speak to that because you've never looked at the results, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, would you agree that when you made contact with Mr. Cayer, you talked earlier about making sure he knew his name and things like that, right?
Yes.
He knew his name.
Yes.
And he knew an address, that is, he was able to write a Cormier address down on for you, right?
I believe I wrote it down, but yes, he volunteered it.
He gave you the address.
Yes.
And those are very sort of simple, basic questions that are asked at the outset to try to assess whether the person can function on a basic level, right?
Yeah, and I mean, he expanded even more in that regard, just because he said he believed he was staying in Seymour, but kind of Cormier was more of his permanent address. So it wasn't, I mean, it was a little bit more in depth. You know, he was able to respond.
He was confused about the day of the week, for example, though.
He did act surprised that it was Tuesday, I believe.
Right, because you made some comment about Toka Tuesday, and he didn't realize that it was even Tuesday, right?
Yes.
Okay. So Mr. Cayer then asks you, you had started out by telling him that you wanted his medical needs taken care of first, right? That's something you told Mr. Cayer.
Yes.
And he responded by saying, did I take a car and smash it into somebody?
Yes.
Now, your report says, did I take a care and smash it into somebody? That's a typo, correct?
Yes, there are definitely some errors in there.
What he said was car, meaning vehicle.
Yes, I think it was written as C-A-R-E, and it was supposed to be C-A-R, so that was definitely a grammatical error, yes, typo.
And you're familiar with your report, having read it in preparation for your testimony. Is that fair to say?
That is fair, yes.
Okay, so if I go through the report with you and you don't recall something, we can refresh your recollection with this document, okay?
Okay.
Your report is 27 pages long, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, at some point, a sane nurse came and collected evidence from Mr. Cayer's body. Is that correct?
Yes.
Sane nurse being somebody who specializes in sexual assault cases.
Yes.
But really, this isn't a sexual assault case at all. That's just a person who's an expert in collecting evidence. Fair to say?
Yeah, that's probably a fair way to say it. Yeah.
Wasn't something that you directed to bring in a sane nurse, right?
I think it actually was my idea to say that myself and Sergeant Yankee, I mean, we collect evidence. I've collected evidence on persons and scenes. I've done DNA swabbing, but Dana, specifically this particular nurse, is amazing, and she is very skilled at actually collecting the evidence and has vast training in doing so. So I wanted to specifically use her because in our area she would be the one that would be able to do that more than anyone I'm aware of, at least.
And it's important to collect evidence because it helps us figure out what happened, right?
Yes.
There's physical evidence as one form of evidence, right?
Yes.
And then certainly statements can be another form of evidence.
Yes.
There a variety of forms of evidence can exist. Agreed?
Yes.
Now, calling in the sane nurse was for the purposes of collecting evidence from Mr. Cayer's body. You would agree with that?
Yes, that was definitely the reason.
And you could see that Mr. Cayer was injured, and you told him that you wanted to figure out what all went down with you. That was something you said to Mr. Cayer, right?
Yes.
And he said his best conclusion is you found me by Nicole's family.
Yes, I remember him saying that, yes.
And Cayer then says, I don't know if I had a child or not.
Yeah, I remember talking about a child, yes.
So he says, my best conclusion is you found me by Nicole's family, followed by, and I don't know if I had a child or not.
I don't know, as we sit here today, the exact sequence, but yeah, I do remember those things. Yes, those are accurate.
And I want to talk a little bit about the, do you remember earlier when you were asked questions by Mr. Johnson about the Google Drive? You remember that?
I do.
What's a Google Drive?
It's, it can be private or shared. It's just basically, it can be a cloud-based drive. Google's a company where you would store something and you could access it. It can be shared. You can use a device or a computer or a tablet to access it. It's just something that you can place items on.
Okay. And Mr. Cayer brought up the concept of a Google Drive for you.
Yes, he brought it up.
Brought it up to you, right?
Yes, he brought it up, yes.
And he explained what, quote, appeared to be a manifesto. You remember that?
Yeah, I think that's my words, but...
right, he never used the word manifesto.
No, he did not. That would be my words.
And when you say he provided a path to obtain his manifesto, again, that's your words, manifesto.
Yes, I use the term manifesto.
He did tell you that he has a Facebook account called Jake Diploma Tech, right?
Yes, sir.
What does Jake Diploma Tech mean?
I have no idea.
Did you do any investigation of that at all?
No, I turned that over and just basically said,
And
this is what he's telling me.
you later confirmed that next day, actually, though, that there was a public account, facebook.com/Jake Sambora, right?
Yes.
And even though it was the last name of Sambora, you believe that that was Mr. Cayer's Facebook page?
Yes.
Different last name.
Yes.
And Cayer told you he wanted you to go into his Google Drive, right?
Yes.
And that if you scroll past videos, you'll find a post with Dropbox, and he wanted you to give it to the, did he say psychiatrist?
That was my understanding. If that's the word he used or not, I'm not 100% sure, but I think so, yes.
Okay, because your report says physiatrist. Was Mr. Cayer asking that something from Dropbox be given over to was he asking you to turn something over to a psychiatrist?
That was my understanding, yes.
And if someone wants to know him, they could look at Jake's G Drive,
I do remember that, yes.
describing his life from young ages up to current, right?
Sure, yes.
He told you, in fact, you guys had fairly long, multiple minutes you guys were conversing about this whole G Drive, Facebook type stuff, right?
Yes, I think he brought it back up throughout the interview more than once.
And that some of the folders he has are, quote, bullshit, just him talking about the universe, right?
Yes, I remember that.
And connecting the dots.
Yes.
What does that mean, the universe connecting the dots?
I have no idea.
Did you expand on that with Mr. Cayer to explore what this means?
I showed, as an active listener, Mr. Cayer would have thought I was interested in what he had to say. I was being very, cordial with him and saying I would look at it at a later time.
But the reality is you're not really very interested in that information.
It could be. I wanted to know what it was and maybe look at it different.
Okay.
Could be or could not be important to the investigation, sure.
What you really want to learn, though, is what happened at the crime scene, right?
That would be the main focus, yes.
So you might, as an investigator, you might be interested in these things if it helped you figure out what happened at the crime scene, right?
I'd probably be interested in them no matter what, in the sense that, I remember early on in this conversation thinking, we could have a whole other scene that we don't even know about, or there could be other crimes. That often happens or something. So I want to, I'm not closing my mind to anything, but I also, if we were expanding into something that upset him in, 7th grade, I'm not going to talk about that for 2 hours. I'm going to try to redirect him to what just happened. So that would be kind of how I would explain that.
Okay, and you would agree with me that Mr. Cayer, throughout this interview, expressed considerable confusion about what had taken place that evening?
He was demonstrating confusion, yes.
Starting with, did I smash a car into people, and continuing through the interview, right?
He wanted me to believe that he could not remember, whether that's accurate or he was trying to lead me to believe that. That's what he was representing.
With all due respect, that's when you say he was trying to get me to believe, you don't know what's going through his head, right?
I do not know what's going through his head, no.
And at that time, you have no knowledge of what kind of psychiatric history this man has, right?
Absolutely, I do not know. Never met him.
You know nothing about him, right?
Nope, don't know anything about him.
So whether he's trying to get you to believe something or whether there are organic problems, you can't speak to that, right?
As far as an opinion, you mean?
Yeah.
Or like...
Yeah. I'll withdraw the question. Now, at some point, as the interview progresses, Mr. Cayer tells you that all the information is in there, referring to the manifesto and the folders that he put on the internet, right?
Yes.
So my question for you is, did you said after this was all done, you went and updated other officers, right?
Yes.
Did you ever direct anybody to go look at those internet sites or those Google Drives to figure out what this means?
My position is not a supervisory role. Mine was to interview Mr. Cayer. I did make staff aware of it. I can tell you that it was a expansive crime scene in the sense that we had 3 different crime laboratories, I'm aware, responded. So I know there was a lot of stuff that needed to get done now, perishable, and then, as you move forward, whether I've worked cases with million digital files where, you have to decide what you're going to do or what you're not going to do. So I don't want to step outside the scope. I wasn't the lead detective. I don't know what was looked at or was not looked at. I did pass along that there was this G drive and some Facebook. As we sit here today, I don't know who looked at what.
Okay. Does your report proceed in a chronological fashion?
The report is probably about as best I could do with this exhaustion that I was in. It was chronological in the sense of how he said it, but we would revisit topics, we would expand on topics. So it was certainly my best effort as I reviewed it in preparing for different proceedings in the last 4 years. There's certainly some grammatical errors in it.
Okay. But in other words, the chronology of it follows what took place with your interview with Mr. Cayer, right?
Mostly, yeah, that would be the outline. It would be chronologically as he's telling me it, yes.
So as you and I are walking through this, we're going chronologically in terms of what Mr. Cayer and you were discussing, right?
Yes, that's fair.
And periodically, would you agree that periodically you were trying to redirect Mr. Cayer?
Yes, for sure.
In other words, things were coming out of his mouth that seemed far afield from what happened that night, right?
When I was able to distinguish that he's talking about something that had it wasn't recent or that evening or right before the hospital, I would kind of let him go a little bit, but then try to redirect him. So yeah, my goal was certainly like what happened right before we got here, as opposed to, some other things. But also, I mean, when you were speaking to like motive or when he was upset at certain individuals, that maybe was a little more important. So it's tough for me to understand, not knowing who the victim's names in the beginning, what was important or not important. So that's part of the reason why this is probably a little more lengthy.
Right, but we were just talking about redirecting Mr. Cayer. Remember that?
Yes.
You did have to redirect him, right?
Yes, that's fair.
So when somebody starts to go sort of afield from where they're supposed to be, then as an investigator, you pull them back in and try to get them back to the topic, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay. So, for example, Mr. Cayer started talking about Wendy. Remember, there's many discussions about Wendy, right?
I do remember him talking about Wendy, yes.
And then you redirected him and said, well, what happened right before you were at the hospital here, right?
Yeah, I remember redirecting him numerous times, yes.
And then Cayer pauses and says, I don't fucking know, dude. I was talking to my dad. That was one of the things he said, right?
If it was noted in my report with quotations, it would have been quoting him, yes.
And followed by Mr. Cayer saying, if I was not in a car crash. He brought up a car crash again.
Yeah, he brought up a car crash more than once.
And you actually, even though you didn't want to share all information with him, you did tell him you were not involved in a car crash, right?
I think at one point I would have told him, and it's not a car.
Okay. And Mr. Cayer then started talking about a guy named Z.
Yes.
And thought maybe this was something with Z. Did you expand on that with Mr. Cayer, what that means?
No, I don't think I did. I remember him talking about I remember him talking about a couple of different things that were, I don't know that they were relevant.
And then followed by Cayer thinking he went towards Nicole's family, right?
I don't know the sequence, but I do remember him talking about going towards Nicole's family, yes.
And then there was so he thought, was Mr. Cayer explaining to you that he thinks he attacked Nicole's family? Is that what he's explaining to you?
Sure, as the listener, I think that's what he was representing, that he wanted me to believe that he thought that he was attacking Nicole's family.
But she's in North Carolina, was established, right?
Meaning Nicole was not present, but her family was still in the area. At least that's how I, as the listener, took it.
Okay. And then there's some conversation from Mr. Cayer about wrestling around with a guy named Tim, right?
Yes.
Do we ever figure out who Tim is?
I believe it's noted in my report at one point who Tim was in relation to one of the other females. I believe it's in there somewhere. Okay.
And then you asked Mr. Cayer what car he would have been driving in, and he said it would have been a stolen car?
He talked about, at different parts of the interview, he talked about, did I steal a car and go crash it? Or he talked about Sabrina's car at one point, but then he said, I couldn't have taken the car. This is throughout the course of the interview.
Okay. And then at least at this point in the interrogation, Mr. Cayer says, "Please tell me someone is not gone." You remember that?
I remember him saying that, yes.
But you did know there was at least 2 deceased people, right?
I was aware of that, yes.
And you asked, well, if somebody would have been gone or dead, who would that be? And Mr. Cayer responded with Nicole's family, right?
I remember that, yes.
I want to move forward to page 8 of your report, where this is later on in the interview, and you asked Mr. Cayer again what happened to his hands, and Mr. Cayer is asking you to tell him what happened because this is scaring him. Do you remember that?
I do remember using his hands by saying what happened to your hands, and then throughout this he was wanting me to tell him. I do remember that context. Yeah, I think that's fair.
And then Mr. Cayer says, I went to Appleton, right?
I do remember him saying he went to Appleton.
And you replied by saying you didn't go to Appleton.
I remember him talking about going to Appleton more than once in the interview. But I think one context was he was talking about professing his love by riding a bike all the way to Appleton once, but not leading up to this. It was in a prior date.
Right, the riding the bike to Appleton for 5 hours was a different part of the discussion, right?
Yes.
This part of the discussion, Mr. Cayer says, I went to Appleton, I went to Bonduel, and I went to Shawano. Remember that?
He actually didn't say Shawano. I heard Shawano because he was talking about different places. And I clarified when I said Shawano to him, and he said, no, Sean Wilson. So I heard Shawano, and it was Sean Wilson that he said.
Now, the second blood draw was done against Mr. Cayer at 1 o'clock in the morning. Would you agree with that?
Approximately, sure.
And am I to understand that that was a consensual blood draw with Mr. Cayer?
Yeah, the blood draws were consensual, yes.
In other words, he's asked to provide a blood sample, and he agrees to do so.
Correct.
Okay. Would you agree with me that, in fact, sir, what Mr. Cayer is doing throughout this interview with you is he's describing what he saw somebody else do at the murder scene? Would you agree with that?
No, I would not agree with that.
That what he's describing actually is him witnessing when he's showing a hand and a hacking and stabbing, that what he's doing is explaining to you what another person did, not him. You would agree with that?
There is no possible way anyone that reviews this evidence would arrive at that conclusion.
That's not the conclusion you arrived at?
No, he was talking about his own personal actions. I mean, it was demonstrated in video, audio.
Now, the Nicole conversation, that name comes up periodically over the course of the 8 or 9 hours, doesn't it?
Yes.
And Mr. Cayer thinking he had gone over to Nicole's family's house, right?
There, at different times in the interview, he said, please don't tell me I went to Nicole's family or something. I mean, he talked about Nicole's family or possibly hurting Nicole's family, knowing that he couldn't have got to Nicole.
I want to move forward in the interrogation or the interview process when there's a discussion about who would have been attacked in the bathroom. Okay, we're moving on to page 14 of your report, say halfway through the process roughly, where you're discussing with Mr. Cayer who would have been attacked in the bathroom. Okay?
I don't have a document in front of me. I understand what you just told me, yes.
Okay. And if any of this you don't remember, just I give you a report, you can read it, okay?
Okay.
And at one point you had asked Mr. Cayer why he would hurt anyone other than Sabrina. He said he didn't want to hurt anyone else. You remember that?
I do remember that, yes.
And he started talking about a picture of my soul from back then to now. You remember that?
Yeah, I think I misspelled soul when I reviewed that report as well.
No, it's spelled correctly.
Oh, it is? I
Yeah.
think I misspelled it in a different part of the report then.
Here it's spelled soul, meaning the thing inside a person's body, right?
Correct.
And he says Cayer keeps the key and keeps it in the cage. Did you expand on that with him?
He talked about it. I do remember that, and I remember that was quite creepy. And I remember listening to him, and then when he kind of was talking about that, sure.
And Mr. Cayer talks about the key falling on the ground after Wendy, after they were trying to have a kid that didn't happen, right?
I remember him talking about Wendy, and I remember the cage and the key and the soul and anger and escaping. Yeah, I remember some of those things, sure.
Now you have a quote in here that says, Cayer says, quote, "I'm not schizo."
Yes, I remember him saying that.
So when you put "I'm not schizo" in quotes, those are the exact words Mr. Cayer said to you? Or did you accuse him? Was that? I guess my question is, how did that come out? Did you tell him he must have schizophrenia, for example?
No, I would have not said that. No, not at all. I think, I mean, it's hard. You're asking what he's thinking, what I'm thinking. I guess
I'm asking what provoked the statement. Did you ask him something to get him to say, "I'm not schizo"?
No, I think it was more so like him assuring me that, like, you know, he's not a bad person. He wouldn't want to hurt someone. Me not to judge him. I mean, that would be the context of that. Like, I'm not schizo, man. You know, and that's kind of how I would describe it.
And then Mr. Cayer starts talking about the letter Z again, and how that is the tribe that runs the planet, right?
I don't remember that, but if it's in my report, it's certainly what he would have said then. I remember Z, but I don't remember it being the tribe that ran the planet.
And then he comes back to the manifesto, your words again, or files he wants you to watch that will explain everything, right?
I recall him wanting me to look at those items, yes, and that they would explain everything.
Okay. Can I have 1 minute, please?
I'm going to see what you do. If you want to play video, all you have to do is plug it in.
Yeah.
The output jack, and it'll project.
What I wanted to do was just, at the same time, have Mr. Eichhoff just watch this clip real quick in the private area.
Oh, okay.
Decide what he's doing. Okay, so we talked about the theme of the files that he wants you to watch. It will explain things that came up multiple times in your interview with him. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely more than once.
Now there was a time when you stepped out of the room to check on the status of the exam and the evidence collection from Mr. Cayer's person. Do you remember that? This was the time when Sergeant Yankee advised you that law enforcement was still waiting on a certain search warrant to be completed.
Yeah, I would have definitely stepped out of the room more than once, but very briefly. But I definitely would have tried to note in my report when I stepped out. I definitely stepped out. I think I used the bathroom once. Yeah, I think there was another time where I was kind of seeing what's going on. Is there a search warrant coming? Yeah, I do remember stepping out for those things.
And then after that, you resumed your conversation with Mr. Cayer, and he talked about feeling past numb and losing everything. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I guess I don't remember the specific context, but I do remember him, you know, talking about how he was hurting and things of that nature, sure.
And he talked about going in the house, and my Pikachu card was not there.
Cat. What's the name of my cat? That's in the film.
Was you talking about a Pikachu cat, not a card?
What's the name of the cat?
Yeah, I remember Pikachu being noted in my report. If he's saying it was a cat now, I guess
Okay.
Maybe wrote it down as card. It's quite possible I misheard him or misunderstood.
And you do indicate in your report that you couldn't understand exactly what was being said at times, right?
Yeah, that's definitely fair.
And so it's quite possible that many of the things that are being said are your interpretation, but Mr. Cayer might have been saying something different, right?
No, nothing substantive. I think we were over the top clarifying anything that would have been more relevant. I mean, if it was, about his cat or something of that nature, I maybe didn't clarify it. But if it was something that I thought was more of evidentiary value, I would over the top repeat it, have him affirm it, and clarify that what we were talking about is what he said. Anecdotal things like a cat or a Pikachu card, I probably didn't go into detail about.
Now, I think when Mr. Johnson was questioning you mentioned something about Ike. Did you mention something about Ike?
I do remember him talking about Ike, yes.
And Ike was brought up by Mr. Cayer during that interrogation, right?
Yes.
And that was a baby he was going to have with Nicole. That was the idea?
I think so, yeah. I'm not 100% sure as we sit here today what exactly he was talking about with that.
And then there was some discussion about a specific named psychiatrist, James Kirst or something like that?
Yeah, I do remember that, sure.
That Mr. Cayer is asking you to contact his parents about that person, right?
I know he wanted him contacted. I don't remember who I was supposed to tell, no.
Again, later on when you're talking, he comes back to the Google Drive, and that conversation again occurs later on as well?
Yeah, he brought it up more than once, sure.
I think the only outstanding thing is whether I play that clip or not, so I'd just like a minute on that.
Your Honor, may I approach prosecution table? Is that okay?
I think we're going to take a break, maybe have a break, but otherwise not right now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So I'm just going to play a short clip for you. Can you see what's on the screen in front of you?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Here to see me, know me, is the Jake's G drive. And there is my wife.
Jake's G drive? Where's your computer at, buddy? Is that at your parents'?
Do you have access to it? Anybody has access to it?
Yeah, it's just on Dropbox.
Well, my Facebook I put to public domain.
Okay.
So
What's your Facebook name?
That's right there, Jake's Pointer.
Oh, this is your Facebook name?
I've been locked out of it recently, but you just go down past 5 videos. One of them.
Okay. So the first 5 are
You can, I did something else, but
Okay.
it's not what we're looking for.
Okay.
But then there's 2 more songs, and then the Jake's G drive is,
Jake's G drive?
yeah.
That's what you want access to?
And that's,
Do you want me to access it?
I want you to watch all of it too.
Watch all? Okay. I can do that. What I can do is consent from you to open that up. That's your property.
Yeah. The folder that's called bullshit and the things that are Z's, that's just me talking about the universe.
There's a folder called bullshit.
I don't even have to, that might help a
No,
lot.
I'll watch it all. Watch it
That was
all.
about the universe,
The
but
folder is bullshit, and that's about the universe.
yeah, connecting the dots. And there's just the one with Nicole's story and your story, and I just got on some deep notes.
Nicole's story.
It's called My Existence from 16 to now. And I don't want to talk about it.
I feel like
And then there's Wendy's site where it actually broke down someone's site. And,
Wendy's site.
yeah. One person.
What's your Facebook password?
You don't need the password.
It's open to the public.
Yep. I did that because I got
So-
sick of people coming up to me looking at me like a big shit and like wanting to fight me and like stabbing me.
Okay.
Because of fucking insecurity females. Like that's really necessary.
And it sounds like a lot of people have been messing with you lately. What's that all about?
It's because fucking people can't handle their own problems, they lie about things, just get away from their crap, and then it affects other people's lives. And I have to be the fucking run into it.
Who's the biggest problem? What's the biggest thing that's going on?
It's all, the biggest thing that's killing me right now is the fact that I try to stay on my media side. And
Who's Wendy?
personally, I give it to.
Wendy's the person you gave the world to?
I would.
You would?
But she hates me for rushing in her head that night. She's done the wrong problems, and then she has killed this person who doesn't care about it, and he's playing games that, she's going to kill herself, and now, like, why do you have this, why did someone buy it? What's the Taco Cat t-shirt cost, like $30?
I don't have a Taco Cat t-shirt.
Someone's plasma that goes by, so maybe I probably just fucking didn't know it. But when you have a kid that's on the way, when you go and buy beer and weed and a taco shirt, and you're supposed to be burying the child has to sell her gun that she got sentimentally.
Yeah.
And
What's up with that?
So I don't know,
Versus-
the thing I've got a big picture Thursday. And I just, even if she's not with me, we should just do better with herself.
I guess I don't know your whole story, man, so I'm not going to try to judge it, but
It's all on there.
alright.
Everybody does it.
What, I mean, I guess if it...
Okay. Did you want to put on the record what your starting point and ending points were?
I'll have this as a specific exhibit introduced as a video file.
Okay. Can you just, for the record, indicate where you started and ended?
Yep, so this was a clip from June 7th, 2016, ending at 23:55 p.m., or 23:55 military time, I'm sorry, and beginning at 23:50 in 48 seconds. Fair to say?
If you're using the time that the device itself captures in the lower right-hand corner, that would be on the actual device I captured it with. It's a little bit off from the time in the background. That would be Aurora Baycare's time. There was digital military time and then a traditional clock. So they don't coincide. The file itself, the lower right-hand corner clip, if you're using that, then I would say that looks like what you just presented, yes.
In that clip we just saw was being filmed with a camera just sort of positioned off to the side filming Mr. Cayer, right?
Yeah, that's accurate. Yeah, it'd be like the first half hour of the contact, sure.
And that's where he's talking about the Google Drive and Facebook and things like that, right?
Yes.
and telling you that the full story would be revealed on there, right?
Yes.
Okay. Of who did the crimes, right?
That's no, he was describing it as like the story of him, his life, 16 to, like, I would totally understand him if I read it and watched his, basically all of his videos, it would be the full story of him.
Okay, you didn't interpret it as he's providing that information so you can figure out who committed the crimes.
No, it's not what he was saying. I mean, from his own words, he was saying it was him from 16 forward.
You have testified previously in this case, have you not?
I have, yes.
Testified at the April 9th, 2018 hearing?
Yeah, if you're going off the transcript, that date does sound correct. Yes, that sounds like, I think that was a motion hearing, yes.
And you would agree that during your interaction with Mr. Cayer, he never appeared to show any signs of intoxication or impairment. Do you would agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. That's all with this witness. Thank you.
Thank you. Any redirect?
One question is follow-up to make sure the record's clear. All the audio video that the state played, that I played on behalf of the state today, and I went through those individually with you, but all those accurately depict portions of what Mr. Cayer told you on June 7th and June 8th, 2016.
Correct. At no point did he bring up any other person. At no point did he say, I didn't do this. Not once did he say that.
Okay. I don't have any further questions.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. You may step down.
Thank you.
I think this would be a good time for us to break for lunch. Ladies and gentlemen, just my quick question is, how long of a lunch break do you want or need? Is half an hour enough? Would you like 45 minutes? Half an hour? I got a couple of yeses. Is everyone okay with a half an hour? Raise your hand if you think that's enough. Do you think you need more, sir? 45 minutes? Would that be enough? All right. We'll take a 45-minute lunch break then. Please return at 1:15. Your lunch is here. You're welcome to eat outside. Just stay in touch with the bailiff. And remember not to discuss the case or do any research. Please stand for the jury. Please be seated. Is there anything we need to discuss before taking our break?
No, nothing about the state.
All right, then we'll see you back at 1:15. Thank you.